Many thanks. Many thanks, Simon. And first of all, before I begin, let me thank you for that very kind introduction. I didn't know we were both jumbos either. But I also want to take a moment to thank you for your leadership, your intellectual leadership, and the very dynamic efforts you've made, not just in terms of developing new ideas, but really pushing them through the political process in Washington. You have really taken, at least from my point of view, some of the very best ideas that you and Rob and others have generated, and not just talked about them, but shouted about them, but underscored them and helped people to understand that we have to make some major changes in this country if we're going to cope with and respond to the changes that are going on in the global economy. And coming back from the trip I just made, where I was in China and then with the president in Korea and in Japan, and having visited various parts of that region, we're engaged in a competitive world that is unlike any that we have experienced in the past. There are more countries that are more competitive in more products and in more services than ever before in world history. And I think that a lot of Americans are perhaps not as aware as they should be about the fact that the United States is going to have to make some enormous changes domestically in order to compete in this dramatically changed environment, and to ensure that our living standards for our own people continue to improve, even as other countries, through their own methods and through their own policies, are advancing living standards for their people. But this is a much more competitive environment. And as Lincoln said, because the circumstances are new, we have to think anew and act anew. And I don't think we're doing that adequately in this country. And Simon and his team have really been beating the drums on that point and many others for a very long time, and I commend you for that. And I think that from the point of view of at least my role in the State Department, our collaboration, our working together, our various conversations over the last weeks, months, and year and a half since I've been in this job have been very, very valuable to me. Let me just start out by saying I did have the opportunity very recently to participate in the G20 and the APEC Summits, and to try, as I will throughout this speech, to describe some of the issues that I see and the way in which the United States is going to have to respond. One of the things we clearly are doing through the G20 and other entities is to try to shape the world's economic future in ways that serve both our national and the global interest. And that involves utilizing the G20, but groups like APEC and other international groupings. But I also think that while we focus, and while my job primarily focuses on the international economic policies of the United States, it is at least as important, and perhaps even more important, what we do at home. We're not going to have an effective international economic policy unless we have an effective domestic policy, and we're not going to be the world's leaders for the indefinite future in any area unless we can address our economic challenges at home in a more effective way than we have over the last 20 years. And let me just touch on a few elements of that. First, we have to put our economy and our budget on a sound financial footing over the medium term. Without that, we will not have the resources or the domestic capability of dealing with our domestic problems or meeting global challenges. And this is something that goes back for a very long time. Years ago, I wrote a book called The Price of Liberty, and it was about how we pay for our wars. And it started off with Alexander Hamilton, where all American history, economic history starts with Alexander Hamilton. And the point that was made by Hamilton and by many others during that period and beyond, that strong national finances is necessary, indeed critical, for a strong national security policy and a strong foreign policy. And that is as true today as ever. And therefore, over the medium term, and President Obama has emphasized this repeatedly, over the medium term, we have to put our finances on a sound footing. Second, we have to dramatically strengthen our educational system. If you look at what's going on in Asia and other parts of the world, education is job one. Korea is a very good example. In the 1950s, and the Koreans emphasized this while we were there, in the 1950s, Korea was a destitute country. Poverty level was very, very high. It was, the GDP per capita was the same as many of the poorest countries in the world at that point. And what did they do? They concentrated primarily on education. And what was the advice they got from AID and other foreigners? Don't spend all this money on education, because there are no jobs for these people to get. Once you've given them a good education, what are they going to do? Give them a good college education, high school education. There are no jobs. What are they going to do? The Koreans thought about it in an entirely different way. They said, if we educate our people, then our people will be able to compete in the world. Companies will come, businesses will start basing their desire to participate in the Korean economy on the fact that we have a strong, educated workforce. And the Koreans did this, and the rest is history. But education was at the center, and it's the center of what's going on throughout Asia. Enormous emphasis on education of engineers, scientists, mathematicians, physicists, and others. And you're just seeing large numbers come out of Asian universities, and these are talented people. They strengthen the business environment and the competitive environment, and we're engaged in a very competitive race with these countries. And if we don't maintain a world-class educational system today, it'll be virtually inconceivable that we will maintain a world-class economy 20, 25 years ago. So this to me, 20, 25 years from now, and this to me is going to be a very critical element. If we can't strengthen our educational system today, our economic outlook for 20, 25 years is going to be much more difficult to sustain. Third is modernizing our infrastructure. I don't need to tell anyone who's been to Asia that Asia is modernizing its infrastructure at a very rapid rate. Not just roads, airports, ports, telecommunications, the internet, connectivity at a very rapid rate. In fact, on Thursday, I'm testifying for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on what other countries are doing to modernize their infrastructure to move people, to move goods, and to move ideas and information around. This, to me, is very important. In the 1950s and 60s and 70s, we put a lot of money into our infrastructure, and we have been living on the basis of that rather than putting sufficient new sums into our infrastructure. And we've got to modernize our infrastructure and broaden it, and say not just the roads and highways, but information. If you look at Korea, 96% of Koreans have access to high-speed internet. 96%. Considerably greater than in most industrialized countries, including our own. And then we have to deal with the energy issue through clean energy development, both to reduce dependence on imported oil and other sources of energy, and to deal with our environmental issues. A robust energy policy is critically important for a whole range of reasons that the President stressed and many others have stressed as well. These are the kinds of things that we need to do at home, and there are a number of others, but these, I think, are at the center. And we don't have the abilities to do this in a relaxed fashion anymore. If there were no competitive countries in the world, we could say, well, we'll put this off, we'll kick the can down the road. We can't do this because others are rushing ahead at a very rapid rate and are going to be more competitive because of the investments they're making in these areas. And the very best of our efforts internationally to improve the global system will be jeopardized if we fail in addressing these issues in the United States. The other thing that I want to talk about basically is new patterns of cooperation in this new global economic geography that we face today. We're going to have to continue to work with our global partners to ensure that the evolving international economic system serves our interests and those of our major economic partners. I want to make a more general point. First of all, the key from our point of view is finding new ways to actively engage with other countries. We don't have a world of blocks anymore where you have alliances and you can simply operate within the alliance. We obviously have alliances like NATO and others, but increasingly you have a number of major players who are not part of any alliance with the United States or anyone else, and we have to engage with these countries on an individual basis. India, China, Brazil, Russia. We have to have a much more diversified kind of diplomacy where we work with these countries individually and engage them in a very intensive way. And that means things like the strategic and economic dialogue with China. We have a similar presidential commission to deal with our relations with Russia. We need to find more and more ways of dealing with these major players, both within the group of 20 and other groups of this sort, but also on a very robust bilateral basis. Let me talk about some of the changes that have taken place in the world economy that necessitate a new way of addressing global economic challenges. And I'll just touch on them very briefly. One, as I mentioned, the new economic geography that we face. One of the fundamental characteristics of the world economy is that it is indeed a multipolar world, highly interdependent, but a world in which the interdependence has moved very rapidly, but the international governance process, the international process of coordinating among countries and developing common policies or common approaches has simply not evolved as rapidly as has the degree of interaction among countries or interdependence among them. Emerging economies today are, needless to say, enormously powerful commercial players. They're also increasingly important financial players, and they're developing new technologies. A lot of new technologies are emerging from these countries. And we have to address, as I mentioned, all these challenges. But I think it's also important to realize that many of these countries have agendas that are different from those of the handful of industrialized countries that were the governing steering committee of the global economy in the 1970s, 80s, and much of the 90s, that is the G7 or the G8. These countries had very strong economies and were relatively rich countries. That is to say, they had a very high GDP per capita. The new group of countries that is playing a powerful role are also major players in the global system, but their domestic circumstances, their domestic requirements, their domestic priorities are very different from those of the countries of the G7. Let's take China, for instance. China is a population of 1.3 billion people, but its per capita GDP is only about 1/7 that of the United States. China's GDP ranks 92nd on a per capita basis in the world. Brazil's is 72, and India's is 121. And what this is telling us is that while externally they're very powerful players, internally they see themselves as developing countries, and they have, in many cases, internally, a developing country policy agenda. What do they do to improve living standards for lower income people? How do they develop their agricultural sectors? How do they deal with a whole range of issues that developing countries face? So on one hand, they're major global players, and they need to assume more responsibility for the global system commensurate with their growing economic influence and power. On the other hand, when they look at themselves, they don't necessarily see themselves as strong economies in the sense that we do looking at them from the outside. They see a lot of development problems, environmental problems, resource problems, problems of differences in the case of China between rich parts of eastern China, the large cities of eastern China, and the Yangtze and Pearl River Delta, where GDP per capita, if you look at it that way, is relatively high. And then central and western China, where there are a lot of very poor people living at or perhaps just above the poverty line. So they have a very different domestic agenda, and that in turn affects their world agenda. Second, financial flows are very different today from what they were in the past. If you look at financial flows in the past, they've traditionally been from industrialized countries to developing countries. That's changed. In 1990, the current account of emerging and developing countries as a group was close to balance. In the year 2008, the developing countries together, mostly the BRICS, had a combined surplus of nearly $800 billion. Emerging market reserves now dwarf those of industrialized countries. The developing country reserves, again, mostly the large developing countries, are above more than $6 trillion, up from only $350 billion in 1990, while advanced economy reserves have risen from about $450 billion in 1990 to only about $2 trillion today. And a lot of capital, instead of going from developed to developing countries, is going the other way. The United States is a major importer of capital from emerging economies, China being one obvious developing country supplier of capital, but also many countries in the Middle East, Russia, many other countries that have surpluses. And the other point that's interesting is that while in the past sovereign debt issues have been primarily within the purview of the poorer countries, of the developing countries, Mexico, Thailand, and Russia have all had major sovereign debt crises in the past. This problem now seems to be a bigger issue for industrialized countries. Debt as a portion of GDP for emerging economies is now half what it is for industrialized countries. This is a very big shift. Third is the aftermath of the global recession, and what does it mean? We've just come through the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression, and that has produced enormously high levels of unemployment for a lot of countries, devastated the savings for a lot of people. It's also generated considerable skepticism in the United States and other countries about the benefits of globalization. Now, this was beginning to occur even before the financial crisis, but it is now at a higher level because of the financial crisis. There are lots of doubts in this country about open trade policies, about whether we should continue to further liberalize trade, and even about some kinds of foreign investment in the United States, a more porcupine-ish attitude, shall we say, toward certain kinds of investments in this country. So one of the great challenges that the United States faces is to demonstrate, first of all, that our economy is capable of returning to its previous resilience. We also have to show that our domestic political system is able to make the hard choices needed to put, as I discussed earlier, our financial system on a sounder footing, to produce a robust energy policy, to revitalize infrastructure, to reform education, to devote more resources to R&D, and to pursue a proactive trade policy. Unless we're able to deal with our domestic problems at home, we're going to find it much harder to convince our people that we should have an expansionist, proactive international economic policy. On the other hand, we need to recognize that what's happening around the world means that if you look at where growth is going to occur and you look at where jobs are going to take place here, it's going to be through companies that are able to access foreign markets. If you look at growth in the United States versus, say, growth in China, growth in Brazil, growth in India, these are the countries where there are enormous growth opportunities. And we have to look at our economic future in part in the context of finding ways of identifying opportunities to sell abroad, strengthening the capability of our companies to sell abroad, equipping our workers with the skills needed to produce goods to sell abroad, and having a trade policy which opens markets around the world so that we can obtain access to a larger portion of the market share around the world. As it turns out, in Asia, our exports are growing, as you would expect, because markets are growing. But as a share of the markets of Asia, our percentage is actually declining. Why is this? It's in part because in many cases in Asia, other countries have negotiated free trade agreements. Free trade agreements give their products a better market access to the economies of these countries than countries that do not have free trade agreements with such countries, and that means that as a share of the overall markets, we lose over a period of time. And in the fastest growing part of the world, that is a setback which is going to be harmful to jobs and harmful to growth in the United States. There's another area that's worth touching on, and that is the intensification of global interconnections. Our daily lives are more and more dependent on computers, the internet, electronic transmission of funds, smart grids. All of them face major threats. Global connectivity makes us all far more efficient and many of us far more prosperous, but it makes us all more vulnerable as well. There's issues of cyber terrorism, cyber piracy, assaults on personal data, threats to national security information. These are all dangerous 21st century threats to our economies, our technological leadership, and our security. And then there are these other sets of changes and threats to the global common space, if you want to put it that way, which is we need, in order to make this economy work, the global economy work, free flow of goods and free movement of vessels on the high seas. We need to have security about airspace. We are all vulnerable to measures that interrupt the flow of goods on the high seas through, say, piracy, through disruptions of air traffic, through terrorism. A whole range of these global common spaces are important to our interdependence, but also are very vulnerable to catastrophic acts of terrorism, through piracy, through non-state actors primarily. And more is required to strengthen cooperation amongst the various state actors to deal with these potential threats. The same is true in financial markets, where financial markets are interconnected. We need to find ways of enabling our countries to work together in these areas. So let me touch very briefly on a few areas in which we are trying to strengthen global cooperation to address this new set of global challenges. First of all, we need to demonstrate from the point of view of the United States and other countries that the United States is still able to play the role of a global leader. We need to demonstrate this because if we are not able to lead, there are very few countries that are willing or able to take a strong global leadership position. We've seen this time and time again. Every trade negotiation since World War II has succeeded only because the United States is willing to take a leadership role. This is not to say that other countries are not important. They are, and the United States cannot do any of these things itself, but it needs to take a global leadership role if we're going to make progress in virtually any area. We also have to demonstrate to the rest of the world, who now, particularly after the financial crisis, believes that other models of economic organization, political organization, are the right ones. We have to demonstrate that democracy, free market capitalism, a strong entrepreneurial environment, the free flow of information, diversity, inclusivity are all the key building blocks of economic growth. There are other countries who don't necessarily accept this and don't necessarily believe our economic model is the right one anymore, particularly since they've seen what's happened in the financial crisis. So we have to demonstrate that the way we conduct our economy and we conduct our politics is going to lead to a greater degree of resilience and an ability to come back from current economic difficulties and address the challenges we face. We also have to realize that we need to find new ways of addressing the new group of emerging economies, principally, but not only the BRICS. And that means new forms of partnerships, as I alluded to before. We recognize that these countries are strong competitors, but we also have to begin to see them, as I mentioned earlier, as potentially important and growing markets. To win these markets, we need to develop a much more robust policy of export promotion, pursue trade agreements, as I mentioned earlier, recognizing that while there are those who want us to shy away from or reduce our role in the global system, the answer, or at least one of the key answers to dealing with our domestic problems, is to enhance our activities in the global system, to create new opportunities in the global system. We would be making a mistake of historic proportions if we saw the challenges from China, from India, from Brazil, and other countries as an excuse for pulling back from the global economy. Turning inward would be an enormous mistake. Instead, we need an outward-looking policy that takes advantage of opportunities in the global system and develops not only new trade opportunities, which we need to do, and the President has a very strong national export initiative to do this, but we also have to see these countries as potential partners in helping to address some of the other challenges of the global economic system. One of the examples is development assistance. The United States has played a very active role in providing development assistance for years, but now we should see these new economies as partners in the process of providing development assistance. And there's some very good examples of that. The United States works very closely with Brazil in helping poor countries to develop biofuel programs. We have Brazilian experts and American experts working together to help poor countries to develop their biofuels. We've just agreed with the government of India for the United States and India to work together to help other countries to develop agricultural programs around the world, particularly in Africa, because India has a lot of skills in the agricultural area. They, in the United States, lest we forget, were partners in the Green Revolution. And that if we can see these countries as opportunities, not just for trade, but for partnerships in areas such as global development, it will enhance the process of global development and mean that we don't have to assume as large a share of the burden. Burden sharing is important. Responsibility sharing is important. We also have to make sure that we continue to work with these countries to avoid the development of an environment in which competition for markets, for energy, for capital, for food, or for water are seen as a zero-sum game. If we begin to think of the world in terms of a zero-sum game, we win, they lose, they win, we lose, then we will not be able to develop these concepts of cooperation. We also need to avoid circumstances in which individual countries engage in systematic efforts inconsistent with global norms and global rules to enhance prospects for their domestic economies or their companies that violate international rules at the expense of others. One of the keys to an orderly global system is to ensure that it's a rules-based system. If countries engage in the kind of economic nationalism which enables them to avoid playing by these rules, then you have a breakdown in the system, and I think that would be harmful. Not only would it cause enormous harm to the United States, but it would damage the integrity of the global economic system on which we all depend, and it could have serious security and economic consequences. China, for instance, has a number of policies that they call indigenous innovation, which force the transfer of intellectual property to Chinese companies from foreign companies, or restrict government purchases of products if they're not using indigenous technology, so that they discriminate against companies that import technology to China or have ownership of that technology and don't transfer it to Chinese companies. Well, clearly that kind of policy, that kind of nationalistic policy, is antithetical to a rules-based system, harmful to American companies, because the strength of the United States is to produce innovative new companies, innovative new projects, innovative new products and services, and we want to be able to enable our entrepreneurs, our investors, our researchers to gain the benefits of the time and effort and the resources they put into innovation, and therefore enhancing rules on intellectual property protection, in my judgment, are critical, not just to the stability of the global system and to the strengthening of the rules of that system, but our economic future depends on our ability to sell high-end knowledge-based products around the world. And if we find intellectual property protection breaking down, improper enforcement, that is a direct threat to our own economic future, and therefore that while we cooperate with these other countries in many areas, we have to be very strong in enforcement of rules in this area and in a number of areas, other areas as well. Let me now turn to a few of the institutions that we're using, and then I will stop and we can discuss any of these ideas that you would like. One is the Group of 20. That has met over the years in Washington and London and Pittsburgh, Toronto, and just recently met in Seoul, where the leaders have charted over the course of that period of time a response to the global financial crisis. And I think that while there are still issues to be resolved, it's quite clear to me at least that the international financial crisis would have been a lot worse had these countries not worked together in the context of the G20. The meeting in Seoul was, I think, important. I've seen the press on it, but I think that it was fundamentally important in that it strengthened our international agenda of trying to continue the process of recovery, of global rebalancing, of working together with countries around the world to make sure that the global economic system, or at least the major powers in that system, work together. Summits are not designed to achieve miracles. I've been to them since the Rambouillet Summit, where I was working for Henry Kissinger as a junior economic assistant. Rambouillet was the first of these G summits and started out with 6, and then it went to 7 and 8, and now we have the G20. They were never meant as a way of resolving all the world's problems in one day-and-a-half session. What they were meant to do was to enable countries to work together to establish a common sense of direction, where they would attempt to move ahead to deal with the problems at hand. And I think the G20 was able to do that, and it also enables us to work more closely with China, Russia, Brazil, India, and South Africa, South Korea, and other countries to make sure that while we're not all moving at exactly the same pace with exactly the same policies, the common direction is the same. And I do think that this was an opportunity to do that. I was able to go to the meeting and listen in when the leaders talked, and sat in when they talked, and participated in bilaterals that the president had with other heads of state and government. And my view was that it did advance American interests substantially, because it strengthened the commitment of countries to the notion that if you're going to have sustained growth in the world over the medium term, you're going to need to have balanced growth. And I do think that we made progress and reinforced progress in that direction. I think that was one of the fundamental things. And that will enhance our ability to create jobs in the United States, because other countries will rely less on us to continue their growth. They will realize that they can't grow by depending on the American consumer as much as they have, in part because the American consumer has to rebalance his or her balance sheet after the financial crisis. They have to develop more domestically led growth models at home, which takes some pressure off of our market and gives us the opportunity to sell more in their markets. And the direction that was established in earlier summits was continued at Seoul, and that will be helpful to the United States over the medium term. The other element that I think is important in a more specific way is that the surplus countries have agreed to reduce their imbalances to sustainable levels. Now, that's part of this global rebalancing. The argument was, well, we didn't get as much detail as we wanted. Well, it's very hard to get details at these meetings, but the direction was very clear, and I think we're going to see movement in that direction. If you look at the Chinese 5-year plan, it very much focuses on strengthening domestic demand and domestically led growth and reducing emphasis on or reliance on exports. And I think that will be very important. We're also developing, within the context of the G7, robust proposals on anti-corruption, which avoids putting American companies at a disadvantage, energy cooperation to reduce inefficient energy subsidies, development cooperation, including food security, financial inclusion, which means that people in other countries benefit more from economic growth than before and have greater access to finances. Infrastructure development, which is very important. American companies are quite good at selling to infrastructure projects. Infrastructure is being developed all around the world. It's a big opportunity for American companies. And fiscal governance and tax policy. And let me just elaborate on this for a moment. One of the things that we've been very impressed by is the efforts that countries have been making around the world, in Africa in particular and also in Latin America, to strengthen their domestic tax systems, to reduce tax avoidance, to enable them to have a broader base tax system, to generate more resources internally that they can in turn use for their development, and to make sure that when they do collect taxes, they're very transparent about the uses of government revenues. All of this can be very important in terms of the fairness of their tax systems and the way their people see their tax systems, the way people look at the question of governance. Do they see tax systems as fair? If they see them as fair, they're more willing to pay. If they see the money being used effectively, they're more willing to pay taxes, and in turn they can generate more revenues, and those revenues can help them to strengthen development if they're used in the right way. So these are the kind of things that were discussed, and I think results were achieved in Seoul. Then the APEC meeting, which took place in Yokohama, this was, I think, another important event in the sense that it demonstrated that the countries of the Pacific Basin, which include the East Asians and also countries on this side of the Pacific, the United States, Canada, Mexico, Chile, and a number of other countries also participated. And this was very important to demonstrate that these countries can work together to enhance trade across the Pacific. This meeting is important in the fact that these countries are working together to reduce barriers across the Pacific. The United States will host the next meeting in Honolulu in 2011, President Obama's hometown. And of course, Honolulu is important because it's right in the middle of the Pacific, and it sort of brings together both sides of the ocean. There are other groups that, as I mentioned earlier, were using the Strategic Economic Dialogue with China, the U.S.-Russian Bilateral Presidential Economic Commission, the U.S.-India Strategic Dialogue, and we have obviously a lot of groups within the context of North America, of NAFTA, where we work together. So we're trying to find ways in which we can use these types of dialogues to reduce barriers, but also to find ways in which we can work together internationally to deal with some of the global problems of trade, of finance, and energy, and other difficulties. The big challenges that we now face require global responses, and the big question is whether governments can design new patterns of cooperation and new institutional arrangements to keep up with these challenges. And that is a big challenge. If you look at the way the world responded after World War II, there were no institutions to speak of. They had been, the ones that existed simply were too weak or inadequate to deal with the problems. And we saw what happened in the 1920s and 30s in the absence of global institutional cooperation. So the leaders at that point, led primarily by the United States, President Truman and Secretary Atchison and Secretary Marshall, they put together these institutions along with others, the Marshall Plan, the GATT, the World Bank, the IMF, in cooperation with other countries. And these institutions have been very valuable. Think how much worse the financial situation would have been 2 years ago if we did not have those institutions, if we did not have the WTO to avoid protectionism, if we did not have the IMF to provide liquidity, if we did not have the World Bank to help the developing countries. These institutions have been very valuable, and we need to keep them and modernize them and strengthen them. But we also have new sets of challenges to deal with new types of problems that people didn't dream of in the late 1940s and 1950s when these earlier institutions were established. We have energy issues, we have environmental issues, we have a whole range of new kinds of financial issues, and we have to find ways, and terrorism and things of this sort, we have to find new ways of addressing these, and these require new types of cooperation. And that means, in particular, finding ways of bringing these new emerging economies into the global system. In the 1940s and 1950s, no one would ever have dreamt that India, China, Russia, and Brazil and others would be major economic powers. In fact, at that point, the Russians in particular, then the Soviet Union and China, were totally opposed to these global institutions. Now they've joined. The Cold War didn't end with World War III. It ended with these countries wanting to join the World Bank and the IMF and the WTO. So they're now part of the system. And the fact is that now we need to find ways of engaging them to a greater degree in assuming increased responsibilities for that system and playing by the same global rules that have been so successful for the United States and for other countries. And this is the big challenge. So I would just conclude by saying that we have to do two things. One, to address this challenge of bringing these countries into the global system. As they achieve the benefits from the system, they also have to assume greater responsibility for the system. And the second is where I started out, that we in the United States need to rise to these global challenges. These are greater economic challenges coming from more countries than we have ever faced before. And we have to internally adjust our way of thinking and adjust our way of making decisions and assume a greater sense of urgency about the need to respond to these new developments. If we need to do both, we certainly need to do the latter, which is to respond domestically. But if we do that successfully, we will have a greater degree of influence and legitimacy and capability of reshaping the global system, which is also a very high priority of ours. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Secretary Hormats. We just have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions. If you want to, have a seat. If you're more comfortable, let me give this to you. I'm going to grab this other.
Thanks.
And thank you for taking the time. I have tons of questions, but I get to see you from time to time, so I'm going to refrain from asking. And why don't we just start right here? Go ahead. Please identify yourself again.
Matt Schul from Inside U.S. Trade. Thanks a lot, Mr. Undersecretary. Several observers, and this is about your trip to Asia, several observers and even the APEC leaders in their declaration noted that there are several models for economic integration in Asia. You have on the one hand the TPP model backed by the U.S., and on the other hand the ASEAN +1, +3, +6 models favored.
And then +2 after that, right?
Right. That exclude, that are backed by China and exclude the U.S. Is there a feeling in the administration that the TPP can be the vehicle by which the U.S. can participate and set the agenda on regional economic integration, as opposed to the other model where China would dominate and set the agenda?
Well, that's an interesting question, and we've thought a lot about it. What is the right structure or the right model? Our view is the following. Let me just go through the various groupings. We are now going to be members of the East Asian Summit. Secretary Clinton went to the last meeting, which was in Hanoi. We see this as sort of focused on political and security-related issues. We see APEC as being primarily focused on trade issues, and that engages the United States and a number of countries on this side of the Pacific, as well as China and South Korea and many countries on the other side of the Pacific. So we're focusing on that as a trade-related or trade-focused institution. Within that, but separate from it, is the TPP. One of the goals of APEC was to ultimately create a free trade area of the Pacific, which would be free trade across the Pacific for all the countries that are members of it. Well, we're not quite able to do that yet, but we do see the TPP as a way of pulling together a group of countries that include a number of Asian countries and a number of countries on this side of the Pacific, to reduce barriers that we call a 21st century agreement, which would not only reduce trade barriers, but would have higher levels, higher standards for the environment, higher standards for labor, and we see this as sort of the forerunner of a possible, possibly even broader kind of trade arrangements in the region. So we don't regard this as inconsistent with APEC. We just regard it as an important development, which is consistent with the broader goals of APEC, only separate from it. And then you get the ASEAN pluses that you described. That's important because ASEAN is really at the center of a lot of things that are going on there. The president, for the first time, conducted an ASEAN-U.S. summit, just the president with the leaders of ASEAN. We see ASEAN as very important, and these broader groupings sort of enable us to consult about a wide range of issues. They're not specifically focused on reaching a trade agreement, but there are a great many economic issues that we and the ASEAN countries face together that we need to address. So it's really a broader context, and what it's designed to do, quite apart from the substance, is demonstrate that the U.S. now is playing a re-energized, refocused, and role in the region, and is going to be a greater presence in the region. And what's very interesting about the meetings that we had in Asia and Secretary Clinton's visit and Secretary Gates' visit is these countries want to be sure that the American presence in the region is sustained. We are increasingly welcomed in this region, and they're glad we're back, and so are we. So I think this is the way I'd put it, that none of these are mutually exclusive. They just have different points of emphasis and different points of focus.
I'm going to take two quick ones, and then we'll let you wrap up, because I know we got to keep you on schedule. Hillary, what do you got?
Thank you. Jim Berger from Washington Trade Daily. Mr. Hormats. I'm not simplifying your very astute remarks, but are you essentially saying that the president say this, that the rest of the world has to wait until the United States gets its own economic house in order before it can see a proactive trade policy?
No, that wasn't all what I was saying.
Here, we'll take
This guy's very, that was, let me just be very clear. That is not what I was saying. I am saying very clearly that we should do both, that we should have a very proactive international economic policy in a variety of areas, but we will be stronger in our ability to execute that policy if we can address our domestic problems at home. But we can't wait we can't stop doing the first in order to do the second. We've got to do them both. And I think we can. The key point from my point of view is we have to explain that we're going to be more competitive internationally, and we will have a greater degree of influence internationally if we do the kind of things we need to do domestically. But not that we should wait on the first until we do the second. We don't have that luxury. We've got to do both with a higher degree of energy, and I think the President is committed to that. That's why he spent 10 days in Asia, India, Indonesia, Japan, and Korea, to demonstrate that we do want to play an active role in Asia. But at the same time, in virtually all of his speeches, he made the point that we need to be more proactive at home. This part of the Asian trip was to demonstrate to Americans that we have the opportunity to create jobs at home by being more engaged with the Asians. The other part was to explain that if we're going to take advantage of opportunities in these growing markets, we've got to be more competitive at home. Just so there's no confusion.
We'll let two here, and then that's how
Okay.
we'll
All right.
Real quick, too. First, I think you articulated very well, if you will, a strategic vision for American resurgence. And you laid out the pillars and the points here very well. I've heard the President say many of the same things. Difficulty is...
I hope I'm on the same wavelength.
But the American people haven't. And the truth is, part of what we hear, and we're at a political institution here, is I think what didn't happen in the last couple of years is good things were said but not repeated and articulated over and over. I don't think the American people have a sense this administration has a strategic vision.
Well, let me just make a couple points on that, because I'm very glad you raised that point. I think one of the things that I've tried to do in my job, and I know Secretary Clinton has tried to do it, is that we need to. It's great to be here with this group of people who, some of whom we meet with very frequently, who understand these issues and sort of live them on a regular basis. We've got to, and I put myself very much in this category, go to various parts of the country and talk about this on a more regular basis. And I've tried to do that. In the last couple of months, I've been to northern Indiana, which has been very badly hit. Hammond, Indiana, and Gary have been very badly hit by the financial crisis. Chicago, different parts of Chicago, South Side Chicago, very badly hit. New Orleans, I don't need to tell you what they've gone through. But I do think it is extremely important, and it follows exactly your point. It's extremely important for people such as myself and others to go. I mean, we travel abroad a lot. That's part of what we have to do, and it's productive. This trip was very productive from my point of view. But we need to spend a lot of time going to various parts of the country, talking to people, and explaining the narrative that I've tried to explain here of what we're trying to do and why it's important, of why global engagement is important to jobs at home, and why stronger measures at home are important to our ability to access foreign markets and take advantage of growth opportunities around the world. That kind of message, it's not a complicated message, but it needs to be explained on a very, in a much more extensive way. And I agree with the premise of your point, and I think we need to do this in a more extensive way. Get out there, and I count myself among the people who should be doing more of that.
one last question, and we'll let the Secretary go.
Tacy Schaefer from CSIS and a former minion of Bob Hormats.
Yes.
I believe I wrote the
We
first
went to
Hindi
India
language
together.
toast that you ever gave.
That's right. We went to India together, in fact. I remember that still.
Two quick questions.
Yes.
Where does international investment fit in the administration's strategic plan? And same question about free trade areas.
Okay, international investment. We're now making a major effort to explain to the rest of the world that we're open for investment here. We're an importer of capital. And in fact, one of the things I'm going to testify on in this testimony on Thursday is the importance of infrastructure investment in the United States by explaining what other countries are doing because their infrastructure programs are vast and very robust, and we have to have something similar. The other is that there's a lot of money around the world that would like to invest in the United States and can create a lot of jobs here. And we ought to be in a position of identifying opportunities and making sure that foreigners realize that we're open for investment and we welcome foreign investment. One of the points I alluded to is one of the repercussions of this financial crisis is that a lot of people are, as it were, porcupine-ish about foreign investment. And we have to see this as a great opportunity to bring capital into this country to invest in American companies, greenfield companies, or other companies for that matter. And this is something that we're trying to do, and we're working on very hard to demonstrate that we are open and in our policies. People talk about CFIUS. Well, CFIUS is a very, very narrow has a very narrow realm. It just deals with investment that is related to potential security issues. 98% of investment does not have security implications, and therefore does not even relate to CFIUS, and we ought to try to put all these things in perspective, and we're going to try to do this on the bits. The problem on the bits is that we don't need the Congress to approve the model bit, which we're working on now, but we would need the Congress to approve anything that we brought back, any negotiated agreement, any negotiated bilateral agreement. And therefore, before we come up with a model bit, we want to make sure we have support in the Congress for that, because that will be the framework for what we think, for whatever we bring back that will need advice and consent, because it is a treaty. So we're working on this. We had hoped, frankly, to have this agreed earlier on, but there's a continued discussion with the Congress on what a model bit would look like, and we don't want to start negotiating internationally before we have support from the Congress on at least the broad framework for a model bit. So we would have liked to have moved more rapidly. We want to move deliberately so that we have congressional support when we do.
Thank you so much for being here, for these incredibly thoughtful remarks. And I just have one observation that among the things that we're all going to need, I think, going forward in governing is imagination. I mean, I think this is a period where reimagining America's role in the world, how the world is actually going to look, that of all the tools in the toolbox of diplomacy, one of the ones perhaps we got to dust off a little bit here in the months and years ahead is going to be imagination. And I think that what I concluded listening to this today is how fortunate we are to have Secretary Clinton and her able and spirited leadership at a time of such tremendous global change, and the remarkable team that she's built around her, including, I think, the guy with the best job in the entire administration these days, Undersecretary Bob Hormats. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks.